Everything seemed to be under control. There were no crises, alerts, or emergencies. The routine worked. The money was coming in. The accounts balanced. And the silence gave an impression of safety. I believed that stability was synonymous with dominance. Financial comfort meant protection, because when everything is calm, nothing needs to be reviewed. But it was precisely in this silence that control began to slip, without noise, without warning, without a clear breaking point. This is not a story about getting rich quick, not even about losing everything at once. It's about how excessive comfort can hide risks, and how small, ignored decisions accumulate out of sight. There are no formulas here. There is no easy advice, just a true story told in the first person. A story about false stability, regarding automatic trust, and about the day I realized I had everything, less control. Everything seemed too quiet to raise suspicions at first. The house went to bed early, and the clock ticked away without resistance. I took a deep breath, believing that stability was synonymous with security. There was no rush or noise, just comfort spread throughout the routine. The bills were paid, and the silence seemed like a well-deserved reward. I called it control without ever really testing it. Today I understand that silence can also hide dangers. I used to wake up at the same time every day without questioning anything. The hot coffee marked the predictable start of another cycle. The work was paying off and the results boosted my confidence. I walked through the house as if I knew every detail by heart. No warning lights flashed in my comfortable, distracted mind. The habit of not looking deeply has become part of the scenery. Everything was flowing so smoothly that I stopped observing. When everything is working perfectly, excessive comfort dulls attention. The feeling of stability creates a false emotional shield. I confused tranquility with absolute control of the situation. Minor lapses in care were treated as irrelevant, not out of ignorance, but out of automatic trust in the process. It was easier to believe that nothing would suddenly change, so I continued without revising past choices. Time passed, and I felt rewarded for my effort. The financial comfort gave the impression of infinite potential. I smiled at the ease of the situation, like someone who had won the race. I didn't realize I was running without looking at the ground ahead. The routine became a silent autopilot. Each day reinforced the idea that everything was fine. The surveillance was slowly dissolving without fanfare. There were long pauses between one critical thought and another. During those breaks, I filled them with distractions and excuses. If something bothered me, I called it a passing phase. Comfort served as a curtain to block any doubt. I avoided asking deep questions because it didn't seem necessary. The absence of urgency numbed any caution. Thus, the risk learned to hide. Looking back, I see how deceptive the weather was. Nothing screamed danger, and that made me too relaxed. Constant normality became an argument against paying attention. I trusted the flow without checking the direction. Each decision seemed too small to matter. However, the group of them grew in the dark. I still didn't know what was forming. This beginning has no visible drama or immediate shock. It is built on the comfortable repetition of days. The story begins before the mistake is acknowledged. It begins when vigilance is replaced by habit, when control is assumed but not exercised. I was exactly at that quiet spot, and I believed I was in the best moment of my life. This hook doesn't herald falls or alarming numbers. He's simply inviting you to join me in this silence. To understand how comfort can distort perception, observe how the absence of noise creates excessive confidence. Nothing here has exploded yet, and that's the most dangerous thing about it, because control isn't lost all at once. It starts to drip when we stop looking. Comfort became the backdrop to everything. Nothing changed, and this consistency seemed like a victory to me. I kept repeating the same steps, believing that this was discipline. Predictability gave the false impression of absolute control. Each month, similar to the previous one, reinforced this belief. I called what was merely habit balance, and custom rarely questions itself. The mornings passed without surprises, and that reassured me. I knew exactly what to expect from the entire day. This predictability gradually made me lower my guard. When nothing goes wrong, attention begins to relax. Care ceases to be a priority and becomes a detail. I saw no reason to revise anything that was working. It worked because it hadn't been tested yet. Financial comfort created an invisible cushion. It absorbed minor impacts without leaving any visible marks. I used to spend money without thinking deeply about the consequences, not out of excess but out of confidence in the constant flow. The money was coming in, and that seemed like proof enough. I didn't assess risks because I didn't feel threatened. The stability convinced me that I was safe. Some signs appeared, but they seemed too small. An overlooked expense here, another there without attention. I kept postponing adjustments because they seemed unnecessary. There was always time to correct it later. This idea of later becoming comfortable. The resolved present negated the urgency of the future, and I accepted that without resistance. The mistake was neither an impulsive action nor a serious oversight. It was the sum of small, silent permissions. I allowed myself not to look closely, not because I didn't know, but because I didn't want to. Comfort makes it easier to avoid questioning, and I chose momentary tranquility, without realizing the accumulated cost of that. There was a very convenient internal narrative. I kept telling myself that everything was under control. He used past results as a guarantee for the future. He confused a positive history with permanent immunity. This confusion made me too relaxed. The internal warning system was getting weaker and weaker, until it almost disappeared completely. A false sense of security sets in when nothing requires effort, when the flow seems automatic and predictable. I lived exactly in that comfortable place. There wasn't enough tension to provoke reflection. Without reflection, control becomes an illusion. I still believed I was in control, but he could no longer hold the steering wheel. This period has no dramatic scenes or conflicts. It is made up of ordinary days and postponed decisions. This is where risk learns to camouflage itself, because nothing seems wrong as long as everything seems the same. Comfort lulls and lulls vigilance to sleep, and that's how I continued for a while, without realizing that the foundation was beginning to give way. The mistake started out too small to receive attention. There was no clear moment of serious decision. It was a discrete habit accepted without resistance, something that seemed logical within that comfortable environment. I used to say it was practical and efficient. Actually, it was just too convenient, and convenience rarely calls for conscience. This habit was repeated without causing immediate pain. That's why I didn't classify it as a problem. He fit in well with the established routine. It didn't disrupt the flow or create conflicts. On the contrary, it seemed to make everyday life easier. I saw it as a sign of maturity, without noticing the relaxation it was causing. Each repetition reinforced the feeling of normalcy. The brain learns quickly when nothing hurts. I kept repeating it without questioning the future impact. The short-term problem always seemed to be solved, and I lived focused only on the present moment. The habit grew protected by the absence of crisis. Thus he became invisible to my eyes. There were brief moments of quiet discomfort, a slight feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I kept pushing that to the back burner. He called it excessive worry or pessimism. Comfort gave me reasons to ignore it. I chose to believe in the favorable scenario, and he continued without adjusting anything. The invisible mistake doesn't announce itself urgently. It settles in when surveillance is absent, when routine becomes justification enough. I wasn't doing anything illegal or irresponsible. I simply stopped looking deeply, and that seemed harmless at the time. But impact doesn't ask permission to grow. I didn't see any clear consequences at first. Therefore, repetition seemed validated. Each month reinforced the idea that I was right. The habit gained strength through prolonged survival. The longer it lasted, the more normal it seemed. And the more normal it became, the more invisible it became. Thus, the risk grew stronger in silence. The problem was never the habit itself. It was the lack of constant review. I stopped asking myself if it still made sense. Trust replaced careful analysis. Comfort has become a deciding factor, and that quietly weakened my control. I still didn't feel the loss happening. This is the kind of mistake that doesn't scare anyone. He doesn't yell or break anything immediately. It just accumulates outside the field of vision. While life seems to go on as normal, I remained convinced that everything was fine, without realizing that the equilibrium was already unstable, and that the price would be charged later. The loss of control didn't happen all at once. It slowly spread into the corners of routine. First, as a nuisance that's difficult to name, then like a subtle pressure in the back of the mind. I felt it, but I didn't want to admit it. I preferred to believe it was just tiredness. Denying it seemed more comfortable than investigating. The choices began to weigh more heavily than before. What used to be simple now requires mental effort. I was wasting energy justifying instead of adjusting. He created narratives to support old decisions. He said it was a phase or a natural adaptation. The problem was that the pressure wasn't decreasing. It just kept changing places within me. Control slips when you're constantly explaining things too much. I explained minor delays and improvised adjustments. Nothing seemed serious in isolation. but the whole thing was no longer lightweight. The margin I thought I had began to narrow. Even so, I insisted on maintaining appearances. To acknowledge it would be to admit that something went wrong. Denial has a calm and convincing voice. She says it's still possible to hold on. It's too early to change anything. I listened to that voice attentively. It matched my old comfort perfectly, so I kept postponing necessary decisions. Meanwhile, the pressure was mounting unseen. I started to feel a different kind of tiredness. Not physical, but mental and silent. A feeling of always being chased, even without major unforeseen external events. The effort stemmed from maintaining the status quo. Maintaining the illusion requires constant energy, and I was spending without realizing it. Control doesn't disappear when something goes wrong. It disappears when we insist on pretending we're right. I adjusted the symptoms but not the cause. He would patch small holes without looking at the structure. That gave me momentary relief, but it deepened the internal instability. The pressure was becoming part of the day. I was still functioning, but it wasn't flowing anymore. Each decision came with a heavy weight. The initial comfort no longer provided the same protection as before. Even so, I resisted changing, because change meant confronting past choices, and that requires uncomfortable honesty. I wasn't ready for that yet. This period is filled with contained tension. Nothing explodes, but everything gets tighter. This is where the control really starts to fail, not due to a lack of resources, but due to a lack of clarity. I was inside this silent process, and he still believed he could hold on, without knowing that collapse was already approaching. The collapse came without noise or warning. It presented itself as just another ordinary day. Nothing seemed different when he woke up that morning. The world continued at the same pace as always, but something inside me was already out of alignment. I felt a fragility that I couldn't explain, and that stayed with me all day. When I realized the true extent of the problem, it was too late. The money that always responded has stopped responding. There was no immediate panic, just disbelief. I reviewed the numbers, believing it was a temporary error. I recalculated, hoping everything would fall into place. But the silence of the replies was definitive. Control had completely slipped away. The consequences were not explosive. They arrived like a continuous burden. Each obligation seemed greater than before. What was simple became oppressive. The feeling of security quickly disappeared. A constant tension arose in the place. I couldn't relax anymore. The emotional impact came along with the financial one. The trust built up over the years has been broken. I began to doubt my own decisions, not due to incompetence, but due to excessive carelessness. This realization hurts silently, because there is no one outside to blame. Responsibility weighs more heavily when it's internal. I avoided talking about what was happening. Isolation seemed easier at that time. Explaining this would require admitting mistakes, and I still hadn't processed that. Shame settled in without needing words. It manifests itself in the absence of contact, and I distanced myself from almost everything. The nights grew longer and more restless. The silence that once comforted now pressed against them. I kept reliving choices, trying to understand the exact point. There was no single clear culprit. The accumulation of habits was taking its toll. Each thought carried a new weight. Sleeping has become a constant challenge. The real collapse happens from within first. He dismantles trust before even reaching the outside world. I still had material possessions around me, but internally, everything seemed unstable. The emotional foundation had given way, and without it, everything else loses its stability. I was officially out of control. This moment is not a dramatic ending. It's a silent and heavy realization. When you realize you can't pretend anymore, something needs to be confronted head-on. I've arrived at exactly that point. No ready-made answers or quick fixes, just the stark reality before me. Rock bottom wasn't a physical place. It was an internal state that was difficult to explain. I was still present, but I felt absent. The body kept functioning while the mind weighed heavily. Shame mingled with profound weariness. There was no energy to pretend everything was normal. I felt small within the silence itself. The isolation was not imposed by anyone. I myself started avoiding contact. Replying to messages seemed like too much effort. Any conversation required an emotional mask, and I didn't have the strength to endure that. I preferred silence to exposure, so I gradually closed myself off. There was a constant feeling of failure, even knowing that it wasn't total or definitive. The burden came from a belated realization. I could clearly see where I had failed to take care of things. That clarity did not bring any relief at that moment. She only reinforced the silent regret. And that hurts more than the material loss. The comparisons arose uninvited. I remembered who I was before. From quiet confidence and old-fashioned lightness, now everything seemed too far away, as if it belonged to someone else. This internal rupture is difficult to accept, because there's no way to go back to exactly the same point. The nights were the hardest times. The silence amplified each unresolved thought. I was reviewing scenes, trying to change past decisions, knowing that this did not change the present. Even so, the mind persisted. Rock bottom is also mental repetition, and I was trapped in that cycle. Shame has a paralyzing effect. She makes you believe that you don't deserve support. I avoided asking for help or sharing, not out of pride but out of emotional exhaustion. It seemed easier to carry everything alone. Even knowing that this deepened the isolation, the bottom was getting deeper. I had run out of arguments internally. The justifications had lost their force. All that remained was the stark observation. I had gradually lost control, and now I needed to face this without taking shortcuts. This recognition hurts, but it also prepares you, because hitting rock bottom reveals what is real. This issue does not offer immediate solutions. He simply interrupts the definitive denial. There is no comfort or distraction here, only reality demanding attention. I arrived exactly at this place, tired of running away and pretending, ready to listen to what the silence taught. Awareness did not bring immediate relief. It arrived heavy but strangely light in color. For the first time, I stopped defending myself. There were no more narratives to support. I looked at what happened without filters. No excuses and no self-pity. Simply an honest acknowledgement of the journey so far. Accepting did not mean agreeing to the pain. It meant ceasing to fight against the facts. I admitted that I ignored the signs for comfort. I confused tranquility with control. That admission didn't diminish me. She simply dismantled the remaining illusion. And that brought a different kind of quiet. When I stopped explaining, I began to understand. The pieces fit together awkwardly. There were no external villains or fatalities. There were small, repeated choices made automatically. Seeing this hurts, but it also brings order, because chaos loses its power when it is named. I finally knew where I had gone wrong. Acceptance relieved some of the emotional burden. It didn't resolve the situation immediately, but it brought an end to the constant internal war. I stopped arguing with myself. This new silence was more honest. It didn't comfort, but it sustained, and that was already a real start. I started observing without reacting, just documenting how everything worked now. No rush to fix everything at once. No internal promises of quick turnarounds. The focus was on seeing clearly, because without clarity, any action is an escape. I didn't want to run away anymore. Accepting it also brought unexpected humility. I realized how much I relied on comfort, and how much that numbed my attention. This perception does not generate productive guilt. It generates silent responsibility. Responsibility doesn't shout or run away. She simply remains present. At that point, I didn't have any ready answers, but something was missing before. I was completely confronted with reality. No internal masks or self-deception. This changes how you experience the problem. He ceases to be a constant threat, and it becomes something that can be overcome. Awareness doesn't solve everything, but it prepares the ground. It creates a foundation for firmer choices. I was still in the middle of the crossing, but he was no longer lost. Acceptance was the first real step, not to get rich or to regain status, but to regain presence and internal control. The restart was not met with enthusiasm or euphoria. He started out discreetly and almost without hope. I didn't have the energy for grand plans. The only intention is to avoid blindly repeating the same mistakes. Each step needed to be small and deliberate. Excessive ambition no longer appealed to me. I was looking for stability, not speed. I started paying close attention to the basics, simple things that I used to ignore. Take notes, observe, and review without dramatizing. Nothing seemed impressive about this process, but something different was happening inside. I was present in every decision, and that changed the weight of the decisions. There was no focus on recovering everything quickly. That idea seemed dangerous at the time. I knew how haste distorts judgment. The goal now was to regain control, even if it meant giving up comfort. I preferred clear boundaries to pleasant illusions. Calm gradually returned with this attitude. Each adjustment was made without fanfare, without telling anyone, and without promising anything. I was learning to respect my own limits, not as a weakness but as a real point of reference. Control began with daily attention. It's a habit to not leave everything on autopilot. This required effort, but brought stability. There were days of doubt and uncertainty. Starting over doesn't eliminate fear immediately, but now I wasn't running away from him. I watched and followed along anyway. The difference lay in the constant awareness. Nothing was done without being noticed. This quiet vigilance supported the advance. Progress was slow and sometimes frustrating, but he was consistent and honest. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, just restoring internal alignment. Every small bit of stability was valued, not as a victory but as a solid foundation. This gave me quiet confidence. Control returned as an internal sensation, not tied to numbers or status, but to the clarity of knowing where I was and why each choice was made. This clarity naturally reduces anxiety, because there is no longer self-deception sustaining everything. I finally felt like I was on solid ground again. This new beginning has neither glamour nor an epic narrative. It is simple, repetitive, and realistic. But that's precisely what makes it durable. I was rebuilding something essential, neither wealth nor outward appearance, but the conscious relationship with my decisions. And that changed everything, silently. The final reflection did not emerge as a perfect conclusion. She appeared while I was walking in silence, thinking about everything I've confused over time. Having resources is not the same as having control. Comfort can be shelter or a dangerous distraction. I learned this without speeches or theories. I learned this by experiencing the direct consequences of it. Today I understand that risk prefers silence. It thrives where there are no constant questions, where routine becomes an automatic excuse. The mistake wasn't in wanting comfort. He abandoned his vigilance duties in exchange for it. Control requires continuous presence, and presence doesn't mix well with autopilot. Nothing I've experienced makes me an exception. This story could be about many people, especially when everything seems to be working well. The danger does not lie in extreme scarcity. He hides behind a false sense of security, when you believe that nothing needs to be reviewed. That's where I lost my sight. I don't carry this history as a punishment. She became a silent reference, a constant reminder of what truly matters. Today I observe more and react less. I review my choices before they become habits, not to avoid mistakes completely, but so as not to lose sight of them again. The control I'm seeking now is simple, knowing exactly where I'm stepping, understanding limits before they are imposed. I don't need excesses to feel safe. I need clarity and daily attention. This doesn't impress anyone, but it supports any long-term approach. I learned that losing control doesn't happen suddenly. It slips away when we stop looking, when we rely too much on accumulated comfort. Today I don't romanticize falls or new beginnings. I simply respect the natural process of things. Everything requires constant monitoring, including that which seems too stable. If this story leaves any mark, let it be the one to look more carefully, not to live in a state of constant alert. But let's not confuse silence with security. Comfort can be an ally or a trap. It depends on the level of consciousness involved. That's the lesson I learned. I had it all for a while, but only now do I understand what was really missing. It wasn't about money or opportunity. He was a constant presence in his own decisions. Control is born from this constant attention, and it is lost when we stop exercising it. This was the story I had to live through,